24th of February, the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights has recorded 17,181 civilian casualties, with the numbers increasingly rising. Most of the civilian deaths and injuries continue to be caused by the use of explosive weapons with wide area effects, including attacks by heavy artillery, multiple launch rocket systems, missiles, and aircraft. In addition to thousands of civilians killed and injured, we have witnessed the destruction of civilian and critical infrastructure and services, especially using missiles and uncrewed aerial vehicles. Aside from homes, schools, roads, and bridges destroyed, hospitals and health facilities have also been impacted. The disruption of water, gas, heating, and electricity caused by Russian attacks on energy infrastructure is of particular concern, with the onset of winter bringing a new dimension to the humanitarian crisis and putting millions of people at risk. Under international humanitarian law, combatants must not direct attacks against civilians or civilian infrastructure and must take all feasible precautions in the conduct of military operations to avoid, or at least minimize, incidental loss of civilian life, injury to civilians, and damage to civilian objects. Since 2007, two Secretary Generals have expressed their serious concerns over the humanitarian impact of explosive weapons in populated areas. They have consistently called upon parties to conflict to avoid their use due to the high likelihood of indiscriminate effects. Last month, on 18 November, more than 80 states adopted the political declaration on strengthening the protection of civilians from the humanitarian consequences arising from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. This declaration marks a milestone in our efforts to better protect civilians from the consequences of armed conflict. I call on member states to give effect to this declaration. The past 9 months have seen tremendous devastation, much as a result of the use of heavy conventional weapons. Attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure must stop. I also urge states to apply effective arms control measures to address the risks related to arms transferred. I want to reiterate, preventing diversion of supplied weapons and ammunition is essential to avoid fueling conflict and insecurity in the region and beyond. Madam President, distinguished members of the Security Council, the only way to end the suffering and devastation in Ukraine is by ending the war. I appeal to all member states to make every effort for peace. I thank you very much for your attention.
I thank Ms. Nakamitsu for her briefing. I now give the floor to Mr. Daniel Kovalik.
Good evening, Madam President. Thank you. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Dan Kovalik. I am a professor of international human rights at the University of Pittsburgh School of Law. I've taught there now for 10 years. I graduated from Columbia Law School in the great city of New York in 1993. And I've been very involved in human rights issues, human rights cases, particularly in Latin America, particularly in Colombia, South America, which has a major problem with arms going into the wrong hands, into the hands of guerrilla groups as well as right-wing paramilitary groups. And so this has been something I've been following for years, and so I want to share what I've also been studying and learning also about Ukraine and arms shipments there and the danger of those ending up in the wrong hands. So with your forbearance, I'll get right down to it. First of all, I would call your attention to a study done by the German Federal Foreign Office, the publication of the Small Arms Survey in January 2021 called Making the Rounds, Illicit Ammunition in Ukraine. Again, this is from January 2021. This is even before, the major conflict began earlier this year. And what they say is that the outbreak of the conflict in eastern Ukraine in 2014, which we have to remember, that's when it really began, led to the widespread proliferation of small arms, light weapons, and their ammunition. This ammunition, which includes thousands of grenades, rockets, mortar rounds, and landmines, along with vast quantities of firearms cartridges, has spread to nearly every oblast region of Ukraine, including areas located far from the conflict zone. And they said that while the Ukrainian government has taken steps to reduce trafficking of these arms, they said these are daunting tasks given the sheer volume of illicit ammunition in circulation and the numerous modes of transport and smuggling techniques used by traffickers in Ukraine. Now, while they conclude that at that time there was not major transfers of those arms outside of Ukraine, they warn, again, this is 2021, that said, the barriers to smuggling grenades, rockets, and other ammunition out of Ukraine are hardly insurmountable. Even a successful trafficking scheme could radically alter the profile of illicit weapons in some countries. Preventing such schemes and reducing civilian casualties caused by loose ammunition in Ukraine will require a coordinated, sustained effort by Ukrainian authorities and the international community for many years to come. This is 2021. Now let's fast forward a bit. So this is a warning, really, given what comes next. And that is the intervention which began in February of 2022. So as my colleague said, a lot of the information on this can be found in open sources. So here's an article from April of 2022. This is merely 2 months after the war began with the Russian intervention in February. This is a CNN article. What happens to weapons sent to Ukraine? The U.S. really doesn't know. That's the title of the article. And it goes on to explain, the U.S. has few ways to track the substantial supply of anti-tank, anti-aircraft, and other weaponry it is sent across the border into Ukraine. Sources tell CNN. A blind spot that's due in large part to the lack of U.S. boots on the ground in the country and the easy portability of many of the smaller systems now pouring across the border. It is a conscious risk the Biden administration is willing to take. And they quote a senior defense official who said, this is certainly the largest recent supply to a partner country in a conflict. And at this time, there was probably $30 billion or so military had been sent. By the end of January, that's going to probably be about $100 billion all told from the U.S. alone, right? And he says, but the risk both current U.S. officials and defense analysts say is that in the long term, some of those weapons may wind up in the hands of other militaries and militias the U.S. does not intend to arm. So quoting this official, he says, we have fidelity for a short time, but when it enters the fog of war, we have almost zero. It drops into a black hole and you have almost no sense of it at all after a short period of time. In making the decision to send billions of dollars of weapons and equipment into Ukraine, the Biden administration factored in the risk that some of the shipments may ultimately end up in unexpected places, a defense official said. They also quote other officials saying, look, the U.S. really does not have a hold over where these weapons are going. They're depending on Ukraine for information regarding that. And privately, this is according to CNN, officials recognize that Ukraine has an incentive to give only information that will bolster their case for more aid, more arms, and more diplomatic assistance. So in the end, again, in April, they're warning that these arms are going to end up in places we don't want. And of course, they give the example of Afghanistan, where, of course, the U.S. left in a hurry and left, how millions, if not billions of dollars of equipment there, and God knows where that is going to end up. By the way, I want to mention, before I go on much further, that I just spent a week in Donetsk. And I did not myself witness illicit transfers of arms, but I did see the effects of arms that apparently went into the right hands, and these were ordinances, shelling done by Ukraine against a school, against a stadium, against a place people go to get water, because of course water is at a premium in Ukraine. I'm sorry, in Donetsk in particular, because the water filtration system had been destroyed by Ukrainian forces sometime before. And I've been reading that shelling's only increased since I was there. Oh, by the way, a monastery that we helped deliver clothes to, that's being shelled almost daily by Ukraine. So while I'm focusing on illicit arms or arms going to the wrong people, even when it's going to the right people, it's not necessarily ending up in the right places. It's attacking civilians, and that's been happening since 2014, I want to underscore. And that's obviously a problem. And then in June of 2022, you have this article in the Guardian of London. Arms sent to Ukraine will end up in criminal hands, says Interpol chief. Jürgen Stock urges members to cooperate on arms tracing as weapons will flood hidden economy when war ends. So he's saying this with a matter of certainty. Jürgen Stock says once the conflict ends, a wave of guns and heavy arms will flood the international market. He urged Interpol's member states, especially those supplying weapons, to cooperate on arms tracing. Once the guns fall silent in Ukraine, he said, the illegal weapons will come. We know this from many other theaters of conflict. The criminals are even now, as we speak, focusing on them. Criminal groups, again, this is still quoting the head of Interpol, criminal groups try to exploit these chaotic situations and the availability of weapons, even those used by the military, and including heavy weapons. These will be available on the criminal market, will create a challenge. No country or region can deal with it in isolation because these groups operate at a global level. Quote, again, the same Interpol chief, we can expect an influx of weapons in Europe and beyond. We should be alarmed, and we have to expect these weapons to be trafficked not only to neighboring countries, but to other continents. August 2022, CBS News did a documentary, and they have an article about the documentary. Again, why military aid in Ukraine may not always get to the front lines. And they have detail how they estimated back in April, Jonas Oman, who's the founder and CEO of Blue Yellow, a Lithuanian-based organization that has been meeting with and supplying frontline units and non-lethal military aid in Ukraine since the start of the conflict in 2014, said that back in April, he estimated that, quote, 30 to 40% of the supplies coming across the border reached its destination. So you're talking about potentially billions of dollars of equipment not reaching the intended destination. The same article from CBS goes on to say a combination of Ukraine's constantly shifting front lines with its largely volunteer and paramilitary forces has made delivery of the military aid difficult for those attempting to navigate the dangerous supply lines to their destination. Some have raised concerns about weapons falling into Ukraine's black market, which has thrived on corruption since the collapse of the Soviet Union, right, in 1991. So this isn't anything new. This isn't anything we should be surprised about. This is something that we should have been prepared for. But as I go on, you'll see that we have been woefully unprepared, almost willfully unprepared for this. So November 1, 2022, the Washington Post, U.S. races to track American arms in heat of Ukraine war. And what they say is that U.S. monitors have inspected just 10% of high-risk weapons sent to Ukraine. This is incredible. This is November. Again, for months, for years, they're saying, get a hold of this stuff. In November, a little over a month ago, they're saying, well, we probably looked at about 10% of them. Though they said the Biden administration hoped to achieve a reasonable level of compliance with U.S. oversight rules, but admitted it certainly would not achieve 100%. I mean, this, again, should be troubling to anyone. Rachel Stoll, the vice president for research programs at the Washington-based Stimson Center, this is the same article, Washington Post, said officials also must develop long-term plans to ensure the security of surplus U.S. weapons once the conflict with Russia ends, noting, again, Ukraine's history as a theater for small arms smuggling after the Cold War. Again, this has been going on for decades. The challenges in Ukraine echo the larger concerns about how weapons produced in the U.S., the largest global weapons seller, are employed worldwide. Advocates have long complained that despite systems designed to prevent their misuse, foreign partners have sometimes employed those arms against civilians in places including Yemen. Well, we know that, right? I mean, in Yemen, since 2015, the Saudis have used U.S. munitions, including cluster bombs, to attack civilians and civilian infrastructure, and UNESCO historic sites as well. Sophisticated equipment has also fallen into adversaries' hands, allowing the Islamic State to showcase Abrams tanks and the Taliban to pilot Black Hawk helicopters. Again, none of this surprising, but what's being done? Very little about it. Then you have the Voice of America. Okay, this is, the U.S. itself, more or less speaking, quoting the Nigerian president, November 30th, 2022. Ukraine war funneling arms fighters into Lake Chad Basin. So the Nigerian president is complaining this is already happening. He says the war between Russia and Ukraine is allowing arms and fighters to stream into the Lake Chad region, bolstering the strength of terrorist groups. Of course, we saw in the same region, in Chad and the Sahel region of Africa, after the NATO's bombing campaign and war on Libya, illicit arms flooded the Sahel region and fighters as well, destabilized places like Tunisia, Chad, Mali, and even Syria, right? You should read Seymour Hersh's piece about that, Pulitzer Prize winning Seymour Hersh's article about that transfer of fighters to Syria from Libya. But in any case, so this is already happening, according to the Nigerian president. Weapons from Ukraine are already ending up in the hands of extremists. Finally, in terms of what I'm relying on, you can look at an interesting opinion piece in The Hill publication from thehill.com. This is December 7th. This is 2 days ago, 2022. Preventing U.S. weapons from escaping Ukraine is a challenge. Again, underscoring the difficulty, if not impossibility, of getting a handle on all these weapons, which goes back to the first report saying we need international oversight over this. And with respect, and I'm an American, so I can say this, the U.S. isn't going to do it. In fact, 2 days ago, the same day this was written, a House committee that was considering whether to do an audit on weapons transfers to Ukraine and money sent to Ukraine, that resolution was voted down. Congress affirmatively decided we're not going to audit the billions and billions of dollars of weaponry we're sending to Ukraine. As an American taxpayer, I can say I don't like that, but I would think as the Security Council in charge of maintaining international peace and security, you shouldn't like that. Who is watching the watchman here? It is the job of the Security Council to do that. I urge you to do that, but I'll also
Mr.
echo
Kovalik,
the
could I
point of my
just
colleague who opened this,
interrupt you
that
for
the
a
only
minute?
way to
I think we
deal
are
with this.
running short of time. May I request you to
Okay.
to round off as soon as you can? Thank you.
Yes, I'm gonna wind up right now. I just want to reiterate the comments of my colleague who opened this session, saying that what really has to happen is the end of this war, a negotiated end of this war, which I think is possible. We know back in March or April, there was apparently a deal that both sides could have lived with, that apparently Boris Johnson from the UK went and told Zelensky not to sign. But apparently there is a deal, some way to end this conflict. This needs to be ended, and it needs to be ended through negotiated settlement. And again, I urge the Security Council to work towards that end. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kovalik, for your briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the Russian Federation.
Госпожа председатель, благодарим наших сегодняшних бриферов и в частности господина Ковалика, потому что он затронул одну из тем, ради которой мы и попросили созыв сегодняшнего заседания. Это конкретно последствия растущих контрабандных поставок этого оружия, поставляемого Украине в различные регионы земного шара для международного мира и безопасности. Еще одной целью созыва заседания созвано для того, чтобы члены Совета могли дать оценку того, какое воздействие продолжающаяся массированная накачка Украины западным оружием оказывает на перспективу завершения украинского конфликта. Как вы все хорошо помните, вскоре после начала нашей специальной военной операции, одной из целей которых являлась демилитаризация Украины, стало очевидно, что военный потенциал собственной украинской армии быстро истощается. Соответственно, момент, когда киевский режим на Украине перестал бы представлять угрозу для нашей страны, стремительно приближался. Такой сценарий, однако, не мог устроить наших бывших западных партнеров. Они не для этого организовывали на Украине нелегитимный госпереворот в 2014 году, поощряли там махровый национализм и русофобию, перевооружали украинскую армию, делая вид, что контролирует выполнение Киевом Минских соглашений. А на самом деле, стремясь реализовать свои геополитические планы по ослаблению России. О том, что Минские соглашения были только ширмой для перевооружения ВСУ, нам только что цинично поведала бывший канцлер Германии Ангела Меркель. Тогда в ход пошел аргумент о том, что допустить поражение Украины Западу никак нельзя. Во-первых, она якобы после поражения перестанет существовать как независимое государство. Хотя мы никогда подобных планов не озвучивали. Во-вторых, милитаризм и имперские амбиции Кремля Украины якобы не ограничиваются. И Киев, дескать, защищает не только себя, но и весь свободный мир. Этот бредовый тезис вообще нет смысла даже комментировать. Однако оба этих абсолютно ложных утверждения стали обоснованием для запуска лихорадочной кампании по вооружению Украины и оказанию ей косвенной военной поддержки. Именно тогда и началась война по доверенности США и их союзников по НАТО против России до последнего украинца. Столь масштабная военная поддержка, наверное, не оказывалась ни одному государству в истории. Посудите сами, совокупный объем военной помощи одного Вашингтона Киеву, по данным Американского центра международной политики, только с февраля по начало октября этого года составил 40 миллиардов долларов. Если добавить к ним миллиарды долларов, обещанные или уже выделенные Евросоюзом Великобритании, то становится ясно, что на вооружение и помощь Украине менее чем за год была потрачена сумма, превышающая военные бюджеты большинства государств НАТО. Помимо поставок оружия, США и НАТО еще и снабжают киевский режим разведданными, в том числе со спутников, обеспечивают украинские подразделения интернет-связью, осуществляют их подготовку и инструктаж. Если же к этому добавить тысячи, если не десятки тысяч иностранных наемников и сотрудников частных военных компаний, о наличии которых мы узнаем по их трупам и переговорам в радиоэфире, возникает резонный вопрос: украинцы ли на самом деле противостоят российской армии в этой стране? Одно можно сказать точно: без упомянутой западной помощи военные действия на Украине уже давно бы закончились. И это признают сами лидеры преступного киевского режима. Давайте посмотрим, какие последствия, кроме затягивания бессмысленной агонии киевской клики и продолжения страданий простых украинцев, имеют все эти недальновидные действия наших западных оппонентов. Вооружение и боеприпасы старого советского образца нами на Украине достаточно быстро перемалываются. Поскольку их в принципе осталось мало, Запад все чаще поставляет режиму Зеленского вооружение западного образца и более современного типа, среди которых есть и дальнобойные артиллерийские и ракетные системы. Вот на них стоило бы остановиться особо, поскольку они позволяют ВСУ наносить удары по мирным районам Донбасса, до которых украинские артиллеристы раньше попросту не могли дотянуться. За примерами далеко ходить не надо. Вчера мы распространили в качестве документа Совета Безопасности и Генеральной Ассамблеи письмо Донецкой общественной организации «Справедливая защита» с описанием неизбирательных обстрелов жилых и густонаселенных районов. Из этого документа следует, что последние недели в Донецке происходит настоящая бойня с применением западного оружия. Наускиваемыми западными странами украинские каратели пытаются буквально сравнять город с землей. С какой-то остервенелой злобой наносятся ежедневные веерные удары по жилым районам, где нет и не может быть военных целей. Очередной такой преступный обстрел произошел сегодня утром. Места массового скопления людей поражаются в самый час пик, что приводит к значительным жертвам и разрушениям. 4 декабря, например, управляемым артиллерийским снарядом М982 «Экскалибур» калибром 155 мм атакован дворец спорта «Дружбы», в котором организована раздача питьевой воды мирным жителям, из-за того, что еще в феврале Украина отрезала Донбасс от единственного источника водоснабжения. Это не замечают наши западные коллеги, еще 8 лет назад фактически отказавшие мирному населению Донбасса в праве на человеческое существование. Сожалеем, что и у чиновников секретариата ООН не нашлось смелости осудить обстрелы Донецка, хотя по ударам по украинской территории они высказываются постоянно. Число погибших на Донбассе только с 27 ноября 22 мирных жителя, большинство из которых жители Донецка. 83 гражданских лица получили ранения. Повреждены 234 многоквартирных жилых дома, 106 частных жилых домов, 31 учреждение образования, 92 иных инфраструктурных объектов. Особо обращаем внимание, это не последствия падения на жилые кварталы ракет ПВО, как это происходит в ряде случаев в украинских городах, а целенаправленные, сознательные удары по гражданским объектам и домам мирных жителей. Вооруженные формирования Украины без колебаний атакуют из поставленной НАТО артиллерии и сооружения, содержащие опасные вещества. 7 декабря нанесен удар по действующему химическому концерну «Стирол» в Горловке. Снаряды попали в хранилище серы, что вызвало пожар. Сама по себе горящая сера опасности не представляет, но при соединении с водой образуется серная кислота. И в случае определенных погодных условий это может привести к выпадению кислотных дождей. Среди поставляемого вооружения стоит особо выделить американские реактивные системы залпового огня «Хаймерс». Мы точно знаем, и это не раз косвенно подтверждали Киев и Вашингтон, что американские специалисты участвуют в работе этих установок. Наведение «Хаймерс» на цель осуществляется с помощью американских военных спутников, а военнослужащие США на земле осуществляют координацию спутниковой развединформации, загрузку точных координат и программное обеспечение РСЗО и контроль эффективности применения установок. Представители Киева сами признавали, что ни один выстрел из «Хаймерс» не происходит без согласования с американцами. Нас постоянно убеждают в высокой технологичности и высокой точности этого оружия. Мол, оно всегда попадает туда, куда планируется. Итак, какие же так называемые военные цели на Донбассе оказались поражены этой ракетной установкой с одобрения Вашингтона? Я назову лишь некоторые из них. Детский сад в Снежном, школа искусств Брянки, гостиница в Красном Луче, волонтерский центр в Степано-Крынке, бассейн, школа и кондитерский цех в Стаханове, санатории в Алчевске, дома культуры в Нижней Дуванке, Горском и Ясиноватой, Новоайдарский аграрный колледж. Среди жертв работавшие в этих учреждениях люди, учителя, врачи, волонтеры, кондитеры. Десятки мирных жителей убиты американскими ракетами. Не далее, как в этот понедельник, ракеты «Хаймерс» прилетели в корпуса и общежития Донбасского государственного технического института в городе Алчевске. Более подробная информация есть в распространенном нами письме Донецкой МПО. Могут ли эти многочисленные задокументированные удары по мирным объектам быть ошибкой или случайностью? Очевидно, что это осознанное и намеренное участие США и НАТО в преступлениях киевского режима. Из-за жертвы среди гражданского населения, за разрушение социальной и гражданской инфраструктуры, поставщики этого оружия несут не меньшую персональную ответственность, чем украинские артиллеристы и ракетчики. Этим фактом прямое вовлечение США и НАТО в боевые действия на Украине не ограничивается. Поступают сообщения, что российские стратегические аэродромы Дягилево и Энгельс были атакованы с использованием американских спутниковых данных. Модернизированные советские беспилотники Ту-141 «Стриж» наводились на цель с помощью американской глобальной спутниковой системы GPS. Госсекретарь США Блинкен, комментируя их, заявил, что США якобы не побуждали, не предоставляли возможности украинцам для нападения на российскую территорию. Но вот при этом глава американской корпорации Raytheon Technologies Corporation Хейс 8 декабря прямо сказал: «Мы работаем с правительством и предоставляем в режиме реального времени информацию о ситуации на поле боя в Украине, в том числе, когда выпускаются ракеты». Разумеется, мы внимательно фиксируем все подобные преступные действия США и их союзников, они будут иметь для всех причастных конкретные правовые последствия. Отслеживаем и уничтожаемую и поставляемую технику. Поскольку и ее на западных складах становится все меньше, в последнее время Вашингтон и его союзники пытаются активно работать с третьими странами, покупая у них вооружение и военное оборудование и поставляя его Украине. Факт таких сделок недавно признал министр иностранных дел Украины Кулеба. Стоило бы оценить, насколько законны подобные действия. Очевидно, что западные страны, поступая таким образом, нарушают взятые на себя обязательства по международному договору о торговле оружием, которые предусматривают запрет на экспорт в те регионы, где это может привести к нарушению международного гуманитарного права и будет способствовать обострению конфликтов. Но это их, судя по всему, не смущает, и они идут еще дальше. 30 ноября госсекретарь США Блинкен рассказал о возобновлении производства боевых систем советской разработки на предприятиях восточноевропейских государств с целью их последующей передачи киевскому режиму. Организация производства советских и российских образцов вооружений на этих предприятиях регулировалась соответствующими межправсоглашениями, которые предусматривают обязательство не поставлять производимую продукцию без нашего согласия. То есть речь сейчас идет о подталкивании этих стран со стороны США к нарушению основополагающих норм контроля над вооружениями. В общем, это пример того самого пресловутого порядка, основанного на правилах, нарушающих международное право. Госпожа председатель, отдельная больная тема и большая тема – расползания оружия, поставляемого на Украину по всему миру. На сентябрьском заседании по этой теме мы уже предупреждали о рисках попадания оружия к террористическим и преступным группировкам. И это не наши домыслы, а предупреждения и озабоченности полицейских служб самих европейских государств, которые с этим сталкиваются. Так, полиция Финляндии получила оперативные данные о попадании оружия, поставляемого Киеву, к преступникам у себя в стране, а также в Швеции, Дании и Голландии. Оружие той самой НАТО, на которое Хельсинки возлагает надежды по своей защите, теперь угрожает мирной жизни самих финнов. Стоит упомянуть, что проблема воровства вооружений со складов украинской армии началась уже давно. Так, в недавнем докладе УНП и ЮНИДИР упоминается раскрытие еще в 2020 году схемы нелегальных поставок оружия из Украины с участием граждан ЕС в зоне конфликта в Африке и на Ближнем Востоке. Причем речь шла о широкой номенклатуре тяжелых вооружений, включая танки, которым просто неоткуда взяться, кроме как с армейских складов. Разумеется, в Вашингтоне и европейских столицах об этом прекрасно знали, но задача накачать Украину оружием оказалась важнее. Ситуация уже настолько вышла из-под контроля, что вооружения, предназначенные для Киева, всплывают на черном рынке не только в Европе, но и на Ближнем Востоке и в Африке. Господин Ковалик уже цитировал сегодня президента Нигерии Мухаммаду Бухари, который сказал, что украинский конфликт служит основным источником оружия для террористов Боко Харам в районе бассейна озера Чад. Почему эти вопиющие случаи транснационального незаконного оборота оружия, в котором помимо коррумпированных украинских чиновников очевидно вовлечены европейские и американские должностные лица, никак не расследуются? Разве это не прямая угроза международному миру и безопасности, на которую должно быть обращено внимание международного сообщества? То же самое касается и миллиардов так называемой помощи Киеву, от военной до гуманитарной, значительная часть которой оседает в карманах заинтересованных лиц. Мы знаем о соответствующих дискуссиях в европейских парламентах и в американском конгрессе, но видим, как правящая элита буквально затыкает голоса оппозиции с просьбами провести аудит каждого доллара и евро, отправляемого на Украину за счет налогоплательщиков западных стран. В ходе слушаний в Сенате по проекту об аудите, оказываемой Украине помощи со стороны США, представитель Демократической партии Коннелли прямо заявил, что поддерживает транспарентность и подотчетность, но не сейчас. Наверное, лучшей иллюстрацией стремления американского истеблишмента любой ценой поддерживать своего верного вассала сложно себе представить. Госпожа председатель, вряд ли нас сегодня обнадежит и выступление наших бывших западных партнеров. Все они предсказуемо будут пытаться сместить акцент, например, на необоснованные утверждения о якобы осуществляемых военных поставках из Ирана в Россию, которые мы уже неоднократно опровергали. Российский ВПК способен справиться с любыми задачами, и ни в чьей помощи мы не нуждаемся. А вот украинской военной промышленности практически не существует, и за нее работает ВПК западных государств. К тому же западные оружейные компании получают от этого огромные прибыли, лишаться которых ради установления мира они не намерены. В заключение хотел бы призвать тех, кто способен объективно воспринимать информацию, еще раз трезво оценить риски, вытекающие из продолжающейся бесконтрольной накачки киевского режима оружием. Риски для международного мира и безопасности, поддержанием которого как раз и должен заниматься Совет Безопасности ООН. Эти угрозы не уменьшаются, а возрастают, поскольку каких-либо признаков осознания западными странами того, что они подливают масло в огонь, который рискует охватить весь мир, мы не видим. Благодарю вас.
I thank Russia for their statement, and I would now like to give the floor to the representative of Norway.
Thank you, Madam President, and I thank the briefers for their statements. I will make 5 short points. First, we condemn Russia's war against Ukraine in the strongest possible terms. And second, we reiterate our unwavering support for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. Ukraine has a right to self-defense as enshrined in Article 51 of the UN Charter, as well as the sovereign right to ask for and receive support from other states in the exercise of this right. Norway will continue to stand with Ukraine. Third, Russia's war against Ukraine is a blatant violation of international law, including the UN Charter. It is a violation of the core principle on which this organization is built, the sovereign equality of its members, and the inadmissibility of the acquisition of territory by force. Russia must abide by international law and stop its war of aggression now. Fourth, we are alarmed by the recent increase in Russian attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure. The massive waves of missiles and drone strikes on Ukraine clearly demonstrates Russia's complete disregard for the horrible suffering they are causing millions of people. In addition to causing casualties, these cynical attacks have destroyed a large number of power facilities, leaving Ukraine's population freezing in the middle of the winter. Children, persons with disabilities, and the elderly are in particularly vulnerable situations. They must be protected. Fifth, on the transfer of lethal weapons from Iran by Russia, we recall that all states are obligated to respect the restrictions of Resolution 2231. The use of drones from Iran adds even further to the list of Russia's total disregard for international law, the UN Charter, and the decisions of the very Security Council on which it sits as a permanent member. And finally, Madam President, Russia is the one driving weapon flows into Ukraine, and they do so through their illegal war against Ukraine. Almost 1 year has gone since Russia's aggressive invasion, and it's not too late for them to do the right thing, to respect the UN Charter, to withdraw all troops, and to work for a peaceful solution through dialogue and diplomatic efforts. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Norway, and I give the floor now to the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President, and I thank the High Representative for Disarmament Affairs for her briefing. President, I will be brief because we discussed Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine just 3 days ago. During that meeting, we heard Under Secretary General Griffiths' harrowing account of the horrific consequences of Russia's war and his deep concerns about the impacts of Russia's systematic attacks on Ukraine's infrastructure and civilian centres, particularly ahead of winter. We've just seen further OHCHR reporting on potential atrocities against civilians committed by Russia. The irony, given the topic of this meeting, is that Russia is perpetrating this war, including with weapons sourced from Iran in violation of Resolution 2231, and is almost certainly seeking to source weaponry from other UN-sanctioned states, like North Korea, as its own stocks dwindle. We note that despite the resounding calls in this Council, again on Tuesday, for a ceasefire and for peace, dialogue and diplomacy, the Russian president on Wednesday doubled down, confirming that the invasion would continue and that it would be protracted. He also reaffirmed the neo-imperialist nature of the campaign, claiming that, unlike Peter the Great, he had made the Sea of Azov a Russian internal sea. President, in the face of Russia's relentless effort to seize Ukraine's territory in violation of the UN Charter and to dehumanize, kill, and subjugate its people, Ukraine has no choice but to exercise its right to defend itself. If it did not, it would cease to exist. In a similar situation, all of us would do the same. And due to the deep determination to live, Ukraine is prevailing. The UK is proud of the support it is providing to Ukrainian people in the face of this aggression. Defensive support, humanitarian support, and assistance to rebuild critical infrastructure destroyed by Russian attacks. President, Russia can end this suffering immediately by ceasing attacks against Ukraine, including critical national infrastructure and innocent civilians, and withdrawing all of its forces illegally present in Ukraine. We welcome and support Ukraine's initiative for a just and sustainable peace. We again join the international community in calling on Russia to similarly commit to meaningful dialogue and negotiations based on upholding Ukraine's rights under international law and the UN Charter. Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Ghana.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank Madam Izumi Nakamitsu for her briefing. My delegation has also taken note of the information provided by the civil society representative, Mr. Daniel Kovalik. I begin my statement by reaffirming Ghana's complete and unwavering commitment to the sovereignty, political independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine, and affirm Ukraine's inherent right to self-defense under customary international law, codified in Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter. The stability of our international system has been carefully built upon established norms of interstate relations, one of which is the cardinal prohibition of the use of force by one state against the other. Any contrary actions, as we have witnessed of the Russian Federation against Ukraine, undermine the fundamental principles of international law, the values and the purposes of the United Nations Charter, and constitute serious threats to international peace and security. Over the past 9 months, Ukraine has deployed its military and strategic capabilities in asserting its inherent right to self-defense against the armed attack of the Russian Federation, and in a courageous endeavor to preserve its national interest. To such action, there is no prohibition, and neither do the rules of international law or the Charter prohibit the supply of conventional weapons to a state under the armed attack of another. Regrettably, the war has come at the great cost of destruction, damage, and the loss of lives, and with each passing day of missile attacks, the toll of civilian casualties and damage to Ukraine's critical infrastructure continues to compound as the United Nations registers some of the worst humanitarian statistics since World War II. We also remain acutely aware of the looming danger of a nuclear catastrophe as the integrity of the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant is persistently violated. Away from Ukraine, the war has spurred unprecedented levels of global energy, food, and financial crisis, which have derailed the capacity of many developing states to rebound from the impact of the global COVID-19 pandemic, further worsening socio-economic conditions for many communities far removed from the theater of war. It remains in our common interest to end the war and the trail of devastation that is leaving in its path. It is therefore our view that the preoccupation of the international community should be the immediate cessation of military hostilities, a key aspect of which is the unconditional withdrawal of Russian forces from the internationally recognized borders of Ukraine. We reiterate our call on the Russian Federation to end its aggression against Ukraine and to respect its sovereignty and territorial integrity in line with the norms and principles of international law. While diplomatic efforts to end the war may appear to have eluded the international community, we must remain steadfast and unified in our efforts to facilitate a political dialogue with credible guarantees of addressing the respective security concerns of the parties. In its enduring wisdom, the Charter of the United Nations avails several modes of pacific settlement, which promise to deliver our present and collective aspiration for peace in Ukraine, if undertaken with a genuine commitment and greater determination of the warring sides and all stakeholders. We must pursue the path of dialogue, as there can be no military solution to the conflict. Finally, we urge the parties to uphold the rules of international humanitarian law, in particular the requirements for distinction and proportionality to avoid causing needless harm to civilians and civilian infrastructure. I thank you.
I thank Ghana for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of China.
主席女士，我感谢祝满全副秘书长和科瓦利克先生的通报。乌克兰危机持续近10个月，大量武器弹药涌入乌克兰，在枪炮之下，生命显得如此的脆弱。交战双方，特别是普通民众，都遭受了巨大的损失和创伤。今年9月，祝满全副秘书长在向安理会通报时曾表示，大量武器流入受冲突影响地区，存在 转让的风险。刚才他又重复了这一观点。今年6月，国际刑警组织也曾表示，运往乌克兰的武器可能会流入黑市，落入犯罪分子之手。这些警告都不幸严重。据报道，中东、非洲一些武装团伙和恐怖组织已通过非法渠道获得乌克兰流出的武器弹药。国际社会对此应当予以重视，并采取防范措施。长期来看，乌克兰境内大批武器弹药及爆炸物可能对战后恢复重建带来安全隐患。阿富汗、伊拉克、索马里等国在此方面的前车之鉴不可不察。主席女士，中方在乌克兰问题上始终主张停火止战、对话和谈。从危机爆发之初，中方就一直强调，政治解决是唯一出路。一味向战场投放武器，不断扩大武器使用的品种和范围，只会加剧各方矛盾，延长并扩大冲突，让普通民众付出更大的代价。事实证明，只有通过对话谈判化解危机，才能从根本上减少人员伤亡，帮助乌克兰和欧洲地区恢复和平。中方再次呼吁国际社会加大劝和促谈的努力，为当事方重返谈判营造氛围，为政治解决乌克兰危机创造条件。近期，习近平主席在同多国领导人会见时，谈到乌克兰问题时强调，冲突战争没有赢家，复杂问题没有简单解决办法。当前形势下，中方认为国际社会应当坚持4个共同，即共同支持一切致力于和平解决乌克兰危机的努力，呼吁有关各方保持理性克制，尽快开展直接接触，为重启谈判创造条件。2、共同反对使用或威胁使用核武器，倡导核武器用不得，核战争打不得，防止亚欧大陆出现核危机。3、共同努力确保全球产业链供应链稳定，防止国际能源、粮食、金融等合作受到干扰，损害全球经济复苏，特别是发展中国家的经济财政稳定。4、共同为危机地区的平民过冬纾困，改善人道主义状况，防止出现更大规模的人道主义危机。中方将继续秉持客观公正立场，同世界上所有爱好和平的国家一道，为乌克兰危机的和平解决发挥建设性作用。谢谢主席。
I thank the representative of China, and I now give the floor to France.
Madame la Présidente, une fois de plus, la Russie essaie de nous faire croire que cette guerre est le fait de l'Ukraine, encouragée par les États-Unis et par l'Europe. Le 24 février dernier, c'est pourtant elle qui a envahi l'Ukraine au mépris du droit international et de la Charte des Nations Unies. C'est elle qui a déclenché cette guerre en agressant unilatéralement son voisin. C'est elle qui prend chaque jour depuis 9 mois la décision de la poursuivre et de l'aggraver. N'inversons pas les responsabilités, ne confondons pas l'agresseur et l'agressé. C'est la Russie seule qui est responsable de la dégradation de la situation humanitaire. Nous avons entendu M. Griffith mardi nous exposer les répercussions désastreuses de ce conflit. La France continue d'apporter au peuple ukrainien tout le soutien dont il a besoin pour exercer son droit à la légitime défense et préserver sa liberté, sa souveraineté et son indépendance. Elle le fait en soutenant militairement l'Ukraine, à titre national et au niveau européen, notamment au travers de la Facilité européenne de paix. C'est un choix assumé. L'Ukraine se bat aussi pour les principes de la Charte des Nations Unies. Intégrité territoriale, inviolabilité des frontières, indépendance et souveraineté des États, refus de la conquête des territoires par la force, condamnation des guerres d'agression. Seul le respect de ces principes peut garantir la paix. L'adoption par l'Assemblée générale de la résolution intégrité territoriale le 12 octobre dernier est une preuve de plus de l'isolement de la Russie. Le président Zelensky l'a également rappelé en plaçant ces principes au cœur de son plan de paix en 10 points, auquel la Russie a offert comme seule réponse la poursuite de ses bombardements indiscriminés contre les infrastructures civiles ukrainiennes et contre la population. Nous saluons ce plan et nous nous tenons prêts à aider l'Ukraine à bâtir une paix juste et durable. La Russie n'hésite pas à violer le droit international en agressant un autre État, mais aussi en se procurant des armes de manière illégale. Alors que ses stocks s'amenuisent et qu'elle se trouve en grande difficulté sur le terrain, elle cherche à s'approvisionner par tous les moyens, y compris en violation des résolutions du Conseil de sécurité. Il est solidement documenté qu'elle a recouru à des drones de combat livrés par l'Iran. Elle continue de les utiliser dans sa stratégie de ciblage systématique de la population et des infrastructures civiles ukrainiennes. Nous appelons le secrétariat des Nations Unies, comme il en a le mandat, à enquêter sur ces transferts qui constituent une violation de la résolution 2231, ainsi qu'à en rendre compte au Conseil de sécurité. La France continuera d'apporter un soutien militaire à l'Ukraine tant que se poursuivra l'agression de la Russie, de même que se poursuivra l'aide humanitaire, économique, politique que nous lui apportons. Si la Russie souhaite que cessent les transferts qu'elle dénonce aujourd'hui, la solution est simple. Elle a été donnée le 16 mars dernier par la Cour internationale de justice. La Russie doit cesser immédiatement toutes ses opérations militaires en Ukraine. Elle doit se retirer du territoire ukrainien et respecter ses frontières internationalement reconnues. Je vous remercie.
I thank France for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of the United Arab Emirates.
Madam President, I thank Undersecretary General Nakamitsu for her briefing, and we listened carefully to Mr. Kovalik's remarks. When the Council last considered the issue of arms transfers in the context of the conflict in Ukraine 3 months ago, we expressed our concern that the risk of these arms transfers would be compounded if both sides were intent on achieving a military victory and the conflict were to become a protracted one. Unfortunately, the prospects of reaching a negotiated settlement have not grown appreciably closer in the intervening months. Still, there have been signals of a widening recognition that talks are the inevitable path to a durable peace. The UAE is steadfast in its belief that there simply is no military solution to the war. A sustainable end will have to come through negotiations. With that in mind, as the war continues, we must mitigate the attendant risks. In all military conflicts, it is vital to safeguard weapons during transfer, storage, and deployment so they may not inadvertently fall into the wrong hands, particularly terrorist groups. On that note, the UAE welcomes announcements of efforts to mitigate risks associated with arms transfers. That includes plans tailored to the transfer of high-tech weapons systems and regional programs to enhance anti-trafficking capabilities in the region. We also welcome other recent initiatives aimed at strengthening illicit arms trade prevention related to the conflict in Ukraine. The volume and type of arms involved in this case necessitate greater vigilance and transparency. We support calls, such as that by the High Commissioner for Disarmament Affairs today, for effective arms control measures. Madam President, War is not only inhumane and causes untold suffering, but it is also fraught with unintended consequences. The Council has a responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security and an obligation to Ukrainians and people around the world. For its part, the UAE continues to actively support and facilitate mediation and de-escalatory confidence-building measures, and we stand ready to support all efforts towards a peaceful resolution. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the United Arab Emirates for their statement, and I now give the floor to Albania.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank High Representative Nakamitsu for her information. Since the very beginning of this war, we have permanently pointed out the very key aspect of the war in Ukraine. It is a war of choice, an aggression against another country, a blunt violation of international law and the Charter of the United Nations. Everything else we hear or say about developments in Ukraine derives from this. In return, since the very first day, Ukraine has defended itself, has resisted, has pushed back the aggressor, and has called the world for help. Helping Ukraine to defend itself from a brutal war is a moral duty. It is also an essential security imperative, since Russia's actions undermine seriously European and global security and stability. Albania is proud to be among those doing what it can to help Ukraine and Ukrainians. We are assisting a country whose very existence is under threat to resist and escape to the war it has not chosen. International law is crystal clear. A country under attack has every right to defend itself under Article 51 of the United Nations Charter. Ukraine has been under attack for 10 months and is simply defending itself. Its sovereignty, its territorial integrity, and its political independence have been assaulted, which makes self-defense not only a natural right, but also an existential imperative. Therefore, whoever is helping Ukraine in whatever way, legally and openly, is helping not only a nation in need, a nation in danger, a nation under threat, they are also upholding the law and protecting the UN Charter. Therefore, the issue here is not what means Ukraine is provided to resist aggression. In fact, as we are called to speak about lethal weapons, the real and very disturbing issue is the transfer of killing drones to Russia by Iran, in flagrant violation of paragraph 4, Annex B of Security Council Resolution 2231. These drones, first denied and later admitted, delivered by Iran and used by Russia to attack civilians and civilian infrastructure throughout Ukraine, are the real question, the one that needs a clear answer. We expect the Secretary General, in implementing Resolution 2231, to provide soon a full report on the matter. Madam President, we have said it before and want to reiterate. Instead of abusing the time and resources of this Council with meetings like this one today, we should concentrate on real issues. As we speak, Russian attacks are causing casualties, destroying civil infrastructure, in particular the energy supply system, leaving millions of people without access to electricity, heat and water, punishing everyone without distinction. And this constitutes a violation of international humanitarian law. Those who disrespect the law must face consequences. Those who commit crimes must be held accountable. Therefore, Madam President, I would like to conclude by saying that nothing, even less an overused and consumed false narrative, prevents anyone to see the terrible reality in Ukraine, the crimes committed there, but more than anything, the need to stand in full solidarity with Ukraine. It's resistant and it's right, the right to decide on its policies, to choose its friends and its future. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Albania, and I now give the floor to the representative of Kenya.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank USG Izumi Nakamitsu and Mr. Kovalik for their briefings. We take note with extreme concern the ruinous damage the war is causing in Ukraine's lives. Ukraine's legitimate right to sovereignty and territorial integrity and regional and international security. As the Council debates the conduct of war, as we have done so often, including 2 days ago, we must reiterate our calls that every effort be deployed to stop it. We must be more responsive to our fundamental mandate to maintain international peace and security comprehensively. We acknowledge the heavy responsibility Ukraine must bear in defending our internationally recognized borders. While conscripting, training, and arming one's army in times of war is expected, the impact of proliferation of weapons is bound to have a big impact, not only in the country in conflict, but also beyond. Madam President, we are faced with a multi-pronged global crisis from the war in Ukraine. Besides the magnitude of food insecurity, threatening especially developing countries, and a more complicated multilateral order, we must now move to urgently address the unprecedented proliferation of weapons. None of these challenges can be effectively addressed with the war raging on. As the first and foremost effective step, the war needs to end. Kenya, therefore, calls for specific and sustained efforts to reach arrangements to deliver a minimum level of de-escalation and deconfliction while establishing channels of dialogue that will lead to stability. Finally, Madam President, we again call for a cessation of hostilities and for a political settlement that respects the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of Ukraine. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Kenya for their statement. I give the floor to the United States.
For your informative briefing this morning. We all know that actions speak louder than words, but before we discuss Russia's actions, let's discuss Russia's words here in the Council today. It continues to confound my delegation that we are all, once again, brought into this Council to devote our attention to Russia's fictions. In the midst of, and in spite of, its war of aggression against its neighbor Ukraine, Russia has wasted countless hours of the Council's time on fictional dirty bombs in Ukraine, a claim debunked repeatedly by the IAEA inspectors. They wasted our time on fictional biological weapons, supposedly to be delivered to Ukraine's near neighbors on the wings of birds and bats, claims rejected by this Council and rejected by the states parties to the Biological Weapons Convention. Russia uses these stories, these words, to try to distract us from its own aggression. For example, Russia claims that its forces are not committing atrocities, when there's a host of credible reports from a broad range of sources that members of its forces have committed rape, torture, and summary executions in Ukraine. Russia has not come here today to present us with any credible solutions, and these are not credible accusations. What we are seeing is, frustrated on the battlefield, Russia has resorted to destroying Ukraine's critical and energy infrastructure from afar, causing immense suffering to civilians, as we heard just 3 days ago, and defying the international community's call to end its aggression. Despite all of this, Russia has the gall to demand today in the Council that the international community watch from the sidelines as Moscow seeks the destruction of another UN member state. Western assistance to Ukraine is, in the face of Russia's illegal, brutal invasion, is not the problem here. It is Russia's invasion itself. That is the one attribute common to all of Russia's fictions, to all its words. To find any distraction, no matter how odious, no matter how transparently false, to try to shift our focus from the immense and needless suffering Russia has caused and continues to cause to the people of Ukraine. It is Russia that has cynically called for this meeting, alleging an illicit conspiracy of weapons transfers from Ukraine, when, in fact, as others around this table have noted, it is Russia that is complicit in Iran's illegal transfer of unmanned aerial vehicles to Russia in violation of Security Council Resolution 2231 Annex B. Russia continues to use these Iranian UAVs in its war against Ukraine and attacks against civilian infrastructure and cities, which have led to the deaths of civilians. Let me be clear. We've seen no credible evidence of diversion of U.S.-provided equipment. We heard no credible evidence of diversion this afternoon in this council. We would certainly review evidence to support these claims, whether it came from a head of state or an international law enforcement official, if it is produced. We would do that because the United States takes very seriously our responsibility to protect our defense and dual-use technologies and to prevent their diversion. At the same time, the United States is committed to continuing to support the people of Ukraine as they defend their country and their freedom. We are not hiding this support. As others have said, Ukraine has every right to defend itself, and we have every right to continue our long-standing support to its defense. Though we have seen no credible evidence of Ukraine diverting U.S. origin arms and munitions, we must all recognize an inherent risk of weapons capture and diversion on the battlefield in any armed conflict. We have always taken, and the United States continues to take, proactive steps to mitigate this risk. What we have seen is Western origin systems captured by Russia in Ukraine. Russia is, in fact, the only known vector of diversion. Russia has an incentive to spread disinformation about diversion and indeed to actually divert U.S. weapons in order to create a false narrative about our assistance that spuriously discredits Ukraine and seeks to weaken international support for Ukraine's self-defense. The Ukrainian government has committed to appropriately safeguarding and accounting for transferred defense equipment. It is important that we remind ourselves that this equipment is vital to Ukraine's defense, and so Ukraine has a strong incentive to protect it. We welcome the Ukrainian government's formation of a commission to strengthen the monitoring of donated military equipment just this summer. We continue to work closely with our Ukrainian government partners to ensure all assistance continues to be properly used and safeguarded as Ukraine defends its sovereignty and territorial integrity against Russia's ongoing aggression. Helping Ukraine keep and regain control of its sovereign territory is an important factor in limiting potential illicit diversion by Russia's forces, Russia's proxies, criminal groups, terrorist organizations, or other non-state actors. Consistent with our commitment to the serious responsibility of safeguarding against diversion, in October, the United States government published the U.S. plan to counter illicit diversion of certain advanced conventional weapons in Eastern Europe. This was a comprehensive, whole-of-government approach that also engages our allies and partners. While this is a recent publication, it is not a new plan. We have been working to address the risk of diversion since well before last February, including in close cooperation with our allies and key partners. This plan has three main lines of effort. Real quickly, first, working with Ukraine's authorities to monitor and control sensitive and dangerous arms. Secondly, strengthening border controls inside and around Ukraine. And third, enhancing law enforcement capability in neighboring countries. Madam President, while the Russian government is heavily invested in spreading disinformation to justify and distract the international community from Russia's unprovoked war against Ukraine, we and our allies remain firmly committed to supporting Ukraine as it defends its territorial integrity and civilian population against Russia's aggression. And so we take these allegations of diversion of U.S. origin weapons from Russia's officials or pro-Kremlin sources with a healthy dose of skepticism. I will conclude on the subject of diversion with a statement of fact. The most effective path toward reducing conflict and any risk of illicit diversion of arms would be for Russia to end the war that it started and withdraw its forces from all of Ukraine's sovereign territory. This may begin to relieve Russia of its dependence on its many corrosive fictions. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the United States for their statement. I give the floor to Gabon.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Je remercie la haute représentante du Bureau des affaires de désarmement, Izumi Nakamitsu, et M. Daniel Kovalik pour leurs exposés respectifs. Je salue la participation à cette réunion de l'ambassadeur de l'Ukraine. Madame la Présidente, ce Conseil se réunit à nouveau ce jour, pour la seconde fois cette semaine, sur la guerre en Ukraine. Je voudrais réitérer notre refus de la guerre. Je réitère également l'appel constant de mon pays aux partis pour des négociations de bonne foi en vue de trouver une solution diplomatique. Personne ne peut prédire le potentiel de déstabilisation et d'insécurité qu'auront les nombreuses cargaisons d'armes utilisées dans le cadre de cette guerre. Mon pays appelle les parties à respecter leurs engagements en matière de droit international humanitaire, en s'abstenant d'utiliser des armes de destruction massive et en ne prenant pas pour cible les populations civiles et les infrastructures civiles. Les parties sont tenues d'éviter que les civils ne se trouvent pris au piège des mines terrestres. Les parties doivent éviter toute action pouvant infliger des souffrances supplémentaires aux populations civiles et permettre un déploiement sans entrave de l'aide humanitaire. Madame la Présidente, à mesure que la guerre s'enlise, les accusations croisées de menaces d'utilisation d'armes de destruction massive, voire d'armes nucléaires, se font jour. Une telle issue rendrait les auteurs responsables d'une catastrophe aux conséquences irréparables. Mon pays condamne toute utilisation d'armes aux effets indiscriminés, ainsi que toute utilisation d'armes téléguidées dont les cibles privilégiées sont les populations civiles. Nous exhortons les parties à cesser toute escalade verbale et militaire, ainsi que toute action de nature à envenimer les antagonismes. Il est temps de faire taire les armes en Ukraine. Plus d'armes, c'est assurément plus de guerre, plus de morts, plus de destruction, plus de détresse et plus de victimes parmi les populations civiles. Une surenchère dans ce domaine ne profiterait à personne. Elle nuit à la recherche de la paix et ne sert qu'à alimenter les animosités. Je voudrais terminer en rappelant que ce Conseil a un rôle de premier plan à jouer dans la recherche de la paix. Mon pays continuera de se tenir aux côtés de ceux qui proposent des voies alternatives au langage des armes. Je vous remercie.
I thank the representative of Gabon for their statement. I give the floor to Mexico.
Muchas gracias, señora presidenta. Agradezco a la alta representante Nakamitsu y al señor Kovalik por sus presentaciones. Tal y como lo expresamos en septiembre pasado, durante todos estos meses en los que el Consejo de Seguridad ha debatido sobre el conflicto en Ucrania, México se ha referido constantemente a la importancia y a la necesidad de poner especial atención a las implicaciones que tienen las transferencias de armas. Reconociendo el artículo 51 de la Carta de las Naciones Unidas, la preocupación de México sobre las transferencias de armas no obedece solo a la situación actual, se remonta a los inicios del conflicto en el este de Ucrania en 2014. El impacto de las armas utilizadas en este conflicto es omnipresente, pero el precio más alto lo han pagado los civiles, con sus vidas y con la destrucción de zonas habitacionales e infraestructura, incluidos hospitales y escuelas. Si bien algunos exportadores han hecho declaraciones relacionadas con las precauciones que han tomado para las ventas y los envíos de armas, dado el alto volumen de transferencias, es prácticamente imposible mantener bajo control todo el ciclo de vida de estas armas. Y no digamos los riesgos inherentes al tráfico y desvío de las mismas. Estas circunstancias son inevitablemente explotadas por las organizaciones criminales. La proliferación de armas en posesión de civiles tiene múltiples y muy riesgosas implicaciones. De manera más reciente, hemos tomado nota de los diversos alegatos sobre transferencias de vehículos aéreos no tripulados. Independientemente de su origen, estos también han sido utilizados en contra de civiles y de infraestructura civil, lo cual es a todas luces violatorio del derecho internacional humanitario. La organización Small Arms Survey ha publicado informes sobre la transferencia de una amplia gama de armas que van desde rifles hasta sistemas de defensa aérea portátiles. Tales informes también alertan sobre el número creciente de armas en posesión de civiles sin ningún tipo de registro. A mediados de noviembre, una corte en los Países Bajos emitió una sentencia en contra de aquellos involucrados en el derribo del vuelo MH17 de Malaysia Airlines, ocurrido en el este de Ucrania en 2014, argumentando que fue resultado de la transferencia de un sistema denominado BUC de misiles tierra-aire. Todos estos informes sugieren que en efecto no hay un control eficaz de las transferencias de armas. Todos los países que son parte del Tratado sobre Comercio de Armas deben apegarse a sus disposiciones, especialmente en lo referente a la denegación de transferencias que estarían en violación del tratado, así como en la aplicación de los estrictos análisis de riesgo que estipula el propio tratado. Pero igualmente llamamos a aquellos países que todavía no son parte del ATT a cumplir responsablemente con los más altos estándares de precaución en sus transferencias con criterios de objetividad más allá de los intereses de empresas privadas o de carácter geoestratégico. El asunto es, pues, crítico, toda vez que la vida de muchas personas en realidad depende de ello. Por lo mismo, subrayamos que más allá de las decisiones actuales para la aprobación de nuevas ventas y transferencias, es tiempo de empezar a establecer medidas más específicas para el control de armas antes de llegar a la etapa posconflicto, a la que llegaremos. Mientras más tiempo pase, será más difícil lograrlo y las consecuencias de no haberlo previsto a tiempo las resentirá de nueva cuenta la sociedad civil. Señora Presidenta, es posible que esta sea una de las últimas ocasiones en las que México se refiera al conflicto en Ucrania como miembro electo de este Consejo. Por ello, quiero reiterar la postura de mi país. La vía militar no ofrece una solución cercana ni viable. Es tiempo de que el Consejo de Seguridad y la comunidad internacional se enfoquen en promover más el diálogo y los entendimientos diplomáticos. No hay que descartar las opciones de mediación, las ya conocidas y las que puedan surgir. Poner fin al suministro de armas presupone negociación y tregua. Presidenta, México reitera su compromiso con el respeto a la soberanía, la independencia política y la integridad territorial de Ucrania dentro de sus fronteras internacionalmente reconocidas. Muchas gracias.
I thank Mexico for their statement, and I now give the floor to Brazil.
Thank you, Madam President. I would like to thank High Representative Izumu Nakamitsu and Mr. Kowalik for their inputs. Madam President, over the years, this Council has sought to incorporate into its agenda issues whose relationship with international peace and security is not always clear. Interestingly, the nexus between weapons and armed conflict has received less attention. This linkage is explicitly recognized by the main instrument of international law on conventional arms exports, the Arms Trade Treaty, which commits exporting states to consider whether arms transfers would contribute to or undermine peace and security. On the other hand, all states have the inherent right to self-defense, as enshrined in the UN Charter, and consequently the right to acquire arms for their security, including from outside sources. It should also be recalled that the ATT explicitly prohibits transfers of arms and ammunition that would be used in the commission of genocide, crimes against humanity, grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions of 1949, attacks directed against civilian objects or civilians protected as such, or other war crimes. In the past years, we have witnessed the phenomenon of the growing urbanization of conflicts, the increasing involvement of non-state actors, and the use of methods and means of war that do not comply with the principles of distinction and proportionality. Additionally, we see a risk regarding the problem of illicit trafficking of conventional weapons and ammunition. The weapons now being used in the conflict in Ukraine will possibly fuel, in the future, other conflicts in different regions of the world. As to the case in point, it should be recognized that the supply of arms and ammunition to the parties to the conflict in Ukraine might result in prolonging it and in more suffering for the civilian population. On the other hand, it is undeniable that a state has a right to self-defense in case of violation of its sovereignty and its territorial integrity. It is a principle enshrined in the UN Charter. This discussion, however, distracts us from fulfilling our mandate, which is to maintain peace and security, and therefore work towards a ceasefire and negotiations. We must bear in mind that international humanitarian law, norms, and principles are mandatory at all times and under all circumstances. Respecting and ensuring respect for international humanitarian law is not only a legal obligation, but also an effective way to protect civilians. Madam President, Article 33 of the UN Charter assigns to the Council the responsibility to explore avenues of dialogue in favor of the peaceful solution of disputes. And I quote, "The Security Council shall, when it deems necessary, call upon the parties to settle their disputes by such means." End quote. After more than 9 months of conflict in Ukraine, we must recognize that this body has still to fulfill its mandate. Brazil is concerned that signs of openness to dialogue have been in short supply. Last July, the Black Sea Grain Initiative provided, in the words of USG Rosemary DiCarlo, a beacon of hope for all in the face of a global food crisis. There have also been occasional arrangements to exchange prisoners of war. The harsh reality, however, is that the belief in the feasibility of a military solution continues to be present, and not only by the parties to the conflict, whatever the cost in terms of human suffering. Madam President, once again, we reiterate the call for an immediate ceasefire without preconditions. Saving human lives must take precedence over any consideration, including the just desire for reparations and punishing those responsible for war crimes. Brazil adds its voice to those of other members in favor of dialogue and recalls that the world looks to this Council in the expectation that it will fully exercise its responsibility to stop this spiral of violence. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank Brazil for their statement. I give the floor to Ireland.
Thank you, Madam President, and thank you, High Representative Nakamitsu, for your briefing. I note the presence of Mr. Kovalik. Madam President, the facts surrounding the war in Ukraine are clear. Ukraine was a peaceful, independent country. Russia chose to upend that peace and to violate Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. It did so in 2014 when it illegally annexed Crimea. It did so again this year when it launched its brutal war of aggression. What is less clear is the justification for today's meeting called by the Russian Federation. Ukraine did not commit or threaten to commit an armed attack against Russia. It was Russia which attacked Ukraine and which cynically sought to justify its invasion by invoking Article 51 of the UN Charter. It is Russia which now seeks to deny Ukraine its entirely legitimate right of self-defence as enshrined in the UN Charter. Ireland, along with all EU member states, rigorously implements our international obligations. We apply the EU common position, under which EU member states assess exports of military technology and equipment against a range of criteria, including a specific criterion on risk of diversion. Attempts by the Russian Federation to frame this urgent and necessary support for Ukraine's defence as an uncontrolled supply of weapons are once again a poor attempt at obfuscating their grievous actions. The EU and its member states are determined to support Ukraine for as long as it takes. We are greatly concerned by the manner in which Russia is acquiring and using unmanned aerial vehicles in Ukraine, as well as reports of ballistic missiles obtained from Iran in contravention of Resolution 2231. The comments by the DPRK ambassador to Moscow that his country is to supply Russia with ballistic missiles in contravention of Resolution 1718 is also of serious concern. Russia's actions risk undermining these essential resolutions and the authority of this Council. For its part, Ukraine has sought to restore peace. President Zelensky has offered a roadmap to peace, his 10-point peace plan to end this senseless war. Russia has responded with a barrage of missile strikes, bringing further death and destruction, further worsening the humanitarian crisis which Russia's war has caused. Madam President, we ask that Russia stop trying to use this Council as a platform for its disinformation, to paint itself as the victim of its own aggression in the face of the heinous actions it has committed. Instead of using disinformation to falsely blame others, Russia should cease its aggression against Ukraine and should do so immediately. Ireland once again calls on Russia to withdraw its troops and engage in good faith in dialogue and diplomacy to bring about a peaceful resolution of the conflict in line with international law and the UN Charter. Millions of lives in Ukraine depend upon this. Thank you.
Thank you. I would now like to deliver the following remarks in my national capacity. At the outset, we thank Under-Secretary General for Disarmament Affairs, Ms. Izumi Nakamitsu, for her detailed briefing. The trajectory of the Ukraine conflict is a matter of profound concern for the entire international community. We believe that internationally agreed principles and regimes should be respected and upheld by all countries. This Council would recall that since the commencement of the conflict in Ukraine, India has been consistently calling for an immediate cessation of hostilities and for an end to violence. We have emphasized that dialogue and diplomacy are the only way forward. Actions that exacerbate the conflict should be avoided. Rather, all efforts should be made to de-escalate and bring both sides to the negotiating table. As our Prime Minister has said, today's era is not an era of war. In a globalized world, the impact of the conflict has not just been limited to Europe. We've all experienced its consequences in terms of surging costs and shortages of food grains, fertilizers, and fuel. The Global South, in particular, is feeling the pain acutely. We must therefore not initiate measures that further complicate the struggling global economy. On our part, we are providing humanitarian assistance to Ukraine and economic support to our neighbors under economic distress. We very much hope that the international community will continue to respond positively to the call for humanitarian assistance. India has dispatched 12 consignments of humanitarian aid to Ukraine so far, and we stand ready to do more. India's approach will be to promote dialogue and diplomacy with an overarching aim to end the ongoing conflict and work with other partners to mitigate emerging economic challenges, particularly to the developing countries. Colleagues, it is in our collective interest to work constructively, both inside the United Nations and outside, towards seeking an early resolution to this conflict. In conclusion, I reiterate that the global order is anchored in the principles of the UN Charter, international law, and respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of states. Thank you. I now resume my duties as the President of the Council. The representative of the Russian Federation has asked for the floor to make a further statement. I give them the floor.
Спасибо, госпожа председатель. Мы всех внимательно выслушали и попросили слова для того, чтобы привлечь ваше внимание к тому, что по теме сегодняшнего заседания, последствиям накачки Украины оружием, наши бывшие западные партнеры не выдавили из себя ни слова. И это несмотря на приведенные сегодня факты и свидетельства. Вам просто нечего на это сказать. Поэтому вы продолжаете использовать нарратив, сводящийся к повторению одних и тех же тезисов на каждом заседании. По вашей картине мира во всем и всегда виновата Россия. Других объяснений у вас уже давно нет. И в этой своей слепоте и глухоте вы продолжаете курс, который может привести к последствиям глобального масштаба. Это стало еще более очевидным после сегодняшнего заседания. Так вот, дамы и господа, хочу подчеркнуть, что вам не удастся свалить на Россию вину за то, что украинские каратели из вашего оружия убивали и продолжают убивать мирное население Донбасса, которое они терроризировали с 2014 года. А также за то, что из-за процветающей коррупции украинских, европейских и американских чиновников оружие из Украины оказывается в руках международных террористов и помогает разжигать конфликты в других регионах мира и убивать там мирных жителей. Ни у кого, кто смотрит наше заседание, не остается никаких сомнений в последствиях ваших действий для подрыва международного мира и безопасности. А отрицание нашими американскими коллегами в микрофон очевидных фактов и тенденций, выраженное ими стремление продолжать бесконтрольно накачивать Украину оружием, я думаю, по достоинству оценят не только незаангажированные члены ООН, но и, собственно, американские налогоплательщики. Хотя бы ради этого наше сегодняшнее заседание, безусловно, стоило созывать. Благодарю за внимание.
I thank the representative of Russia for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Ukraine.
Well, thank you, Madam President. Distinguished members of the Security Council, Under Secretary General Nakamitsu, I also recognize the remainder of representatives of terrorist Russia in the permanent seat of the Soviet Union. It is becoming grotesque, and soon it won't be a surprise to see Leo Tolstoy's major work called Special Operation and Peace to comply with Putin's laws. After all, it is also a mix of fictional narrative, history, and often perverse philosophy, like many Russian statements in this chamber. If somebody right in your face tells you that, and I quote, Eastern Ukraine had good reason to join Russia, end of quote, or an even more delusional quote, Russia's intervention in Ukraine is legal under international law, end of quote. Who in their right mind would refer to the author of these statements as an authoritative source in this global watchdog of international law and order? Of course, there is freedom of speech in this country, including for alumni of otherwise respectable university. But for God's sake, even in a city where cannabis is now legal, there is no need to fill this chamber with the smoke of conspiracy spam. Russia again attempts to legitimize its flagrant violations of the UN Charter by using the Council as a platform for circulating its propaganda narratives. It is a very simple algorithm that Moscow has explored since Soviet times. But as you said yourself, Mr. Kovalik, you are an American and you can say what you want. Of course you can. But why in the world do you waste our time? Neither American taxpayers nor ours do approve this frittering away their money. Let me remind you that the largest country in the world, the Russian Federation, pays less than 2% of UN regular budget. It hardly covers this debauchery. First, you have to blame the victim, and the more resolutely the victim resists, the more assistance it receives from responsible nations. The graver the accusation should be. Second, the lie should be wrapped up in numerous terms and names, technical characteristics and numbers. All these are supposed to make fakes look like facts. In particular, we have never heard from Moscow why mass graves and torture chambers have been found only in the places where Russian troops were deployed. We can only imagine what we will find in the territories that still remain under Russian occupation. What we do know for sure is the sooner these territories are liberated, the more Ukrainians can be saved. We will therefore continue to deoccupy our sovereign territories in strict accordance with Article 51 of the UN Charter. Any other option would be a betrayal of our compatriots who have been compelled to stay in the occupied territories and are now waiting for liberation. We are grateful to all friends and allies who support Ukraine in this noble endeavor, including by supplying modern weapons. Their use has been an element of Ukraine exercising the inherent right to self-defense under the above-mentioned Article 51 of the UN Charter. Madam President, Russia brought the same allegations to the attention of the Security Council on the 8th of September. Let me remind you what happened afterwards. The armed forces of Ukraine launched its operation to liberate the east and south of the country. Since September, thousands of square kilometers in Kharkiv, Kherson, and Luhansk regions were liberated. This is the most powerful and viable evidence that all weapons in Ukraine's possession serve their intended purpose: to help Ukrainian soldiers to liberate our people and our territories. To prevent their illegal use, Ukraine has created and ensured the effective functioning of a multi-level system of arms control. It is carried out on three tracks: circulation and use of small arms and light weapons, export control and supervision of weapons and military equipment transferred by foreign countries. Circulation and use of small arms and light weapons has been controlled on an interagency level that includes the Ministry of Interior, Security Service, State Border Service, as well as other governmental structures responsible for combating illegal arms trafficking. The State Service of Ukraine for Export Control, as well as Interagency Commission on Military and Technical Cooperation and Export Control, are responsible for practical implementation of the state policy in the area of export control over international transfers of dual-use and military goods, as well as implementation of measures to prevent their use for terrorist and other illegal purposes. Ukraine has also established a three-level system control and supervision of weapons supplied by our foreign partners. The parliamentary oversight is carried out by the Temporary Special Commission. The President exercises his constitutional duties through the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine. A special system called SOTA has been implemented there to monitor weapons and equipment supplied by foreign partners, makes it possible to receive information about every single sample of such weapons. At the governmental level, the Ministry of Defense and Armed Forces of Ukraine, together with foreign partners, carry out direct control and monitoring, including through the use of Logistics Functional Area Services System, NowThis. NowThis allows the monitoring of arms supplies to Ukraine, as well as the movement of international technical assistance. In addition, auditors of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine carry out field inspections of weapons supplied by foreign partners. At the same time, we remain extremely concerned about the activities of illegal armed formations, including the infamous Wagner Group, in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. These formations widely recruit people with criminal backgrounds in Russia and use weapons that are not subject to any control mechanisms, including internal Russian ones. Given the fact that Wagner Group is reported to operate on other continents as well, the threat of illicit arms trafficking stemming from the activities of Russian private military companies is more than real and worth being addressed by the Council and relevant international mechanisms. In its turn, the Ukrainian side, both its civil and military representatives, demonstrate transparency and commitment to cooperating fully with our partners as well as within international export control regimes. We will continue to act in this vein as it is fully in line with our main task, full deoccupation of the sovereign territory of Ukraine within its international recognized borders. Following the defeat of Russia and the end of the war, the demilitarization and denuclearization of Russia should take place. It will prevent the threat of the repetition of aggression, thus laying a solid foundation for both the transformation of Russia into a peace-loving nation and for ensuring sustainable peace and security. And I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ukraine for their statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.
Pas